Hello. Today I would like to talk about the POE community's perception on build viability and build diversity. I hear a lot of talk that there is very little build diversity and only a few builds can do uber bosses. I believe this is extremely inaccurate, as I would argue any build can do all ubers with enough investment. Around 80 builds can do all uber bosses smoothly with reasonable investment for the average player, and I think build diversity is very strong. To understand build diversity, though, we need to talk about budget. The budget of a build is extremely variable on when you are playing the league and if a popular build guide is being spread at the time. Based on these two factors, the same build with the same pieces of gear can be 5 to 10 times more expensive at certain points of time. For example, in the first week of a league, there are very little semi-well-rolled items available for trading because people haven't farmed up the large quantities of high level 86 bases, or essence spammed some items, or ROG crafted for profit. Because of this, gear with good life, resistances, attributes, regen, or suppression are very scarce and thus 10 times more expensive than they would be in later weeks, generally speaking. Because of this fact, I would actually suggest that newer players play very casually, if not at all, during the first week of the league. This way, prices of decent items will drop off a cliff in weeks 2 and 3, and people will post updated videos on build guides and farming strategies. This should allow non-veterans of the game to progress the entire game without hitting a brick wall. Where that brick wall is will most likely be determined by how new you are to the game. So on screen right now, you can see 3 different chess pieces that I randomly crafted to illustrate this point. On the far left, you will see an item that has crafted on life and has semi-decent resistances. In the first few days of a league, this item would actually be very strong, since this item was most likely found off the ground, and having triple resistances off the ground is very rare. And in addition to this, the Chaos Resist and Lightning Resist is fairly high roll. Thus, in the first few days of the league, this item would roughly go for 10 Chaos, but if you were to wait a week to play the game, you could get this for roughly 3 Chaos, and then if you waited 2 weeks into the league, this is actually vendor trash, because in pretty much no scenario, if you're a life build, are you going to equip a chess piece with less than 100 life on it. The second item is a little bit better, where in the first few days of the league, if someone found this or crafted it with an essence, it would be worth around 20 Chaos. The reason for this is because Chaos Resistance is very valuable, and it has T2 and T1 hybrid life. But again, if you waited a week, this would probably be a 10C item, and then if you waited 2 weeks, you could get this for 1 or 2 Chaos. Now the third item is the best of all 3 of these, where it has pretty much perfect suffixes, and that is because it was crafted by ROG, and ROG is extremely good at crafting mid-level items. Thus the suffixes give you around 90 resistance and strength, which gets converted into life, and it also has T2 life at a max roll and decent armor and evasion. If this was found or crafted in the first few days of the league, it'd be worth around 30 Chaos, and at that point of the league, since divines are so cheap, this is actually a roughly 1 divine item. But if you were to wait a week into the league, prices of these items would drastically fall, since people are using essences, fossils, and or ROG to craft these, and thus it would actually be 10 Chaos, which at that time would be roughly maybe 10% of a divine. And then if you waited 2 weeks, the market would be flooded with these fairly strong items, and thus you could pick it up for around 5 Chaos. So in saying all this, this should illustrate that if a newer player is struggling in the first few days because they're using items like the ones on the far left, and or even worse, and likely much worse, than if you waited a week or 2 weeks to start playing the game, all your gear would be the gear on the far right, and you really shouldn't have an issue clearing all the content. In addition to this, the second box, where I say the cost revenue and time to acquire, you can see that in the first 2 days, I would estimate that clearing T16 maps smoothly would cost around 300 Chaos for that time. So generally speaking, you would have all your items be equivalently in strength to the mid-tier essence item on screen. And again, this should get cheaper and cheaper as the days and weeks go on. And in addition to this, while items are getting cheaper and cheaper, the amount of money that you can make per day slowly starts going up and up and up. And this is because there will start to be players that accumulate a good amount of wealth and are looking to buy items in bulk. So while in the first few days you could farm up some essences and sell them, the prices of these essences won't be very high, and or you won't be able to farm them very fast because there's not good quality gear for you to smash through the content. Thus, in general, after the first week or so, there should be enough wealthy people in the economy and or demand for crafting materials that you should make at least a divine an hour. And then if you waited 2 weeks into the league, at minimum, pretty much any strategy that you do should be able to generate 450 chaos per hour and or around 3 divines per hour. And thus, if the cost of all your gear is going down and the amount of money that you're making is going up, depending on when you start actually playing the league and pushing your atlas will vastly determine how fast you can actually gear up. And thus, if you are struggling to clear tier 16s on day 2 or 3, it will be infinitely easier to do that same amount of progression in the first day of the second week or 2 weeks into the league. Now that I explained more about what budget means, I'll talk about the build diversity chart I have at the bottom. All these numbers will be based on prices of gear after the 2 week mark, where there should be a fairly large amount of items in the mid to upper mid tier so that you could progress endgame bosses. I believe currently that a vast majority of the community believes that there is only roughly 10 builds that can do all the content in the game, but like I said at the beginning of this video, I believe that pretty much every single build can do all the content, including all Ubers. But first, I will talk about what a vast majority of the community thinks. So that is that if you're going to do Uber bosses, you should play Lightning Strike. And I would agree that this skill is S tier, along with around 9 other skills. So in terms of viability based on budget, if you're playing Lightning Strike, you should be able to clear tier 1 and tier 10 maps with pretty much no gear, which is why I have a 0.25 divine budget for it to clear it smoothly for the average player. And then when you go up to tier 16, maybe you need to recraft your claw with some essences and or have 5 to 6k HP, so you may need to purchase a little bit more gear. But in general, you would have still a low budget of 1 divine to clear tier 16s. Now at this point, you will be going into bosses in the entry level bosses of Searing, Eater, Shaper, Atziri, and Elder. And maybe now you'll start to invest more heavily into armor and evasion and or trying to get max resist on your shield. But at this point, you're not really worried about capping your chaos resistance and or spell suppression. So this will be at 2 divine budget. And then if you're looking to kill Maven, Uber Elder, Cirrus, or Invitations with Lightning Strike, you would be now looking at an 8 divine budget, where you may again need to recraft your claw to have at least attack speed, crit, and 2 elemental damage on it. And maybe now you will start to invest more heavily into spell suppression to try to get to 100%. And then finally, you will start to do Uber bosses, in which it is suggested that you have at least 6k HP and a good amount of armor and evasion, roughly 30k of each at least, and maxed out spell suppression. You should be able to get this amount of gear, again, after the 2 week mark, with around 32 divine. And if you have this gear, the average person should be able to kill Uber bosses, generally speaking. Now, maybe the community thinks this 32 divine budget is a little low. Maybe they think it's 50 divines or 100 divines, whatever. But for argument's sake, let's say it's 32 divines. And let's say roughly 10 builds are able to do all Uber bosses at 32 divines. And this would be considered S tier. But I would argue there is way more than 10 builds that can do it, as I personally have created several builds that have done Uber bosses, as in my Bow Puncture build, my Firestorm Spellslinger build, my Heavy Strike build, my Scorching Ray Righteous Fire build, my Bleed Bladestorm build, and several others. Now, while I have created these builds and have done all the Uber bosses, I am also acknowledging that this is in relation to Softcore, which a vast majority of people play, and it is in Trade League, which a vast majority of people play, but you shouldn't limit yourself on build diversity if you're watching your favorite streamer do SSF hardcore, where I would at least partially agree that if Ben said that there are 10 viable builds to do Uber bosses, I would agree with him, but you shouldn't limit yourself to what builds you do based on what Ben says. So, like I said, pretty much any build can do all Uber bosses. So let's say, for example, Seismic Trap after the nerfs, let's say it's not S tier anymore, let's say it's A tier. Maybe instead of 32 divines, like a Lightning Strike build would require to kill Uber bosses, maybe it takes 64 divines. Maybe you need a good Watcher's Eye. Maybe you definitely need 100% spell suppression. Maybe you need specific multi-modded items, etc., etc. And now going down the line, maybe now that Fire Trap RF has been nerfed, which it originally didn't have that high of DPS. Maybe it is now a B tier skill. And again, maybe you don't need 32 Divines to be able to kill all the Uber bosses on Fire Trap RF. Maybe you now roughly need 128 Divines. For example, maybe you need to have either 85 all resistance, maxed out chaos resist, 40k armor, a Watcher's Eye, 3k life regen. Maybe you need a +2 amulet or a +2 weapon. Maybe you need a +5 fire resistance shield. These are all things that would be fairly expensive in comparatively to a Lightning Strike build. So let's say that B tier, it costs 128 divines to do. And then you go into caster builds, which are notoriously not very tanky, but have decent damage. So maybe these builds will cost you 256 divines, which now you're talking close to the mere level of cost. And same thing with melee builds. Maybe melee builds in general are tanky enough, but they lack damage because you have to move around a bunch for Uber bosses, so the DPS uptime is very low. So maybe for melee builds, you need a very, very high PDPS weapon. So 800, 900 plus for a two-hander, or 500, 600 plus for a one-hander, which is extremely expensive, 50 divines for just the weapon. Maybe you need a roughly mirror's worth of gear to kill Uber bosses, but I would argue these are still viable Uber boss killers. And then you get into the very bad and or meme builds. So, like I said, I have created a heavy strike build that has killed all the Ubers. It was a Slayer. It uses Mage Blood. It has a very high PDPS weapon, and it has a very close to mirror level shield that I crafted with Rog. So, yes, you can kill Uber bosses with heavy strike. And then I would go as so far to say that a build like Void Sphere, which no one uses for DPS because it is a terrible skill. It's basically just a skill that you use to remove corpses. I would argue that if a person wanted to do Void Sphere and they like the aesthetics of it and they just love the skill in general, if every single one of their items were mere tier, I would guess that a person could kill all the Ubers with a Void Sphere build. So now the argument becomes, okay, all these builds can do Uber bosses. It's not just the 10 builds like Lightning Strike that can do it. Are you willing to farm up the roughly 250 divines to do a boss? My argument is yes. Like I said, I have made bow puncture builds, I have played heavy strike builds, I have played non-meta builds that kill these Uber bosses. I enjoy those skills. I partially enjoy playing off meta skills. So yes, I am willing to farm up the 250 divines, which, I mean, there are several farming strategies on my YouTube in which you are getting a minimum of 5 divines per hour, and you could go up to 12 divines or so in later stages of the league. So let's say, for argument's sake, you are not very good at these strategies and you only make 5 divines per hour. Am I willing to farm up 50 hours to play the build that I want to play to kill all the content in the game? I would argue yes. Because the league is 3 months long, let's say someone plays for roughly 10 hours per week and you make 5 divines per hour, that's 5 weeks that you can make pretty much any build kill all the Uber bosses. I would argue this is more healthy for the game. I don't think you should limit yourself to what Ben thinks is meta. You should play what you want to play. You should have fun playing it, because I believe many people lose sight that games are meant to have fun. So, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the comments, and I'll get to them. Thanks.